you have a unique perspective. In this particular series, we've been looking at what are the threats and how can we prepare for them? What people call prepping or preparations. A lot of people still wonder if they need to do it, and what might drive them to do such things. I know for myself, I haven't thought about it except the events of the last few years has now driven me into a lot of action. In your case, from what you see, what's the predicament of the world right now?
Well, the predicament of the world is that we have a date certain, and the date certain is 2028. That is when the current model that was set in motion in 1604 runs its course. And it's lovely to actually know that we can say that there's going to be a period at the end of the sentence, at the end of the chapter, at the end of the book. And the reason why we have certainty on that date is because it is on that date that the current structure of how we do the vast majority of our economy in what we call the developed world actually runs into an existential no-go zone. And what that is the termination of the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, pension schemes. We run out of money in 2028. And that's assuming we don't run out before. But it's wonderful to have a date on the horizon where you kind of know, oh, that thing is getting closer. And the reason why that's important is because what we have to be thinking about is that right now, somewhere between 30 and 40% of all the expenditure of every dollar that's spent in this country goes to supporting the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And in 2028, the primary check writer for that is bankrupt.
And do you think that there might be any changes as far as how they might create more funding for it, or why is 2028 kind of like a date carved in stone?
Well, because that's when the trust fund actually expires. So what you can do is you can obviously tax people into oblivion, but adding 30% tax to our current tax basis is politically non-viable.
Right. Great
news is not having Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is also politically not viable. So the system level collapse, or we should say at least the system level reorganization, is an inevitability. And because of that, it's actually nice to take a measure of it right now, because we're still sitting, while we see kind of that asteroid approaching us, it's still an asteroid right now.
Yeah.
And the great news is we have time to actually think about, what would we do if we knew that the models we're currently using aren't going to be around in now 6 years?
So let's get back into your background a little bit as to why we should be listening to you when you're saying these types of things. Talk about your academic background and then the kind of work that you do.
Well, so my PhD, University of Virginia, I was on the medical school faculty at the University of Virginia. We did the clinical trials organization. I founded the first medical device clinical trials organization at the University of Virginia. So I did a lot of work in the industrial medical complex back in the 90s. Prior to that, I was at Ball State University at the Human Performance Lab, where we did very interesting things like the final formulations of Gatorade. I've been around the medical and the physiology/sports medicine area for a long time. Prior to that, Goshen College for my undergraduate. The long arc of my life, however, has had kind of nothing to do with my academic preparation. I studied law at the University of Virginia, on the business school faculty there. I've done a lot of things in the academic world, but the reality was that in the 1990s, I started a company called Mosaic Technologies. And that company had a very unique charter. Our job was to do treaty-restricted technology transfer. And what that means, in kind of very plain English, is countries that were affected by the end of the Second World War, where they had to sign treaties that said they would never export offensive military technologies. My company went around the world and went into the Q labs from a James Bond movie, where you go in the lab and they've got all kinds of cool things that shoot and blow up and do all this. I went into those labs to try to find stuff that would be of strategic interest to the United States or others of our allies. And then my job was to find civilian ways to export military technology. And I did that for a decade. Now, the great thing about that is when you are in those kinds of environments, you meet very interesting people. Those people are, relatively speaking, inaccessible. They're not the kind of people you have at dinner parties. Some of them you probably wouldn't want at dinner parties. But what's beautiful about them is they actually represent kind of the cutting edge of human thought, because they are the people who think about ways to either transform the world for good or for evil at the extreme. So this is not minimum viable product.
Yeah.
This is the inevitable consequence business disruptor, and that's what these people are about. So the great news is I had the decade of the 90s to see the cutting edge of the best and worst of humanity. And the good news is I got to participate in an enormous amount of that.
Right.
So a lot of the technologies we use today are technologies that I was actually deeply aware of. But linked to that was I found out that technologies are often a decoy. They're the theater in front of which the public actually assembles. But behind that theater are the producers. They're the organizations that have the financial interest to see the things that win or lose. And often what you find is that the thing that wins is not the best thing. It's the thing that keeps a facade going. And so an enormous amount of the work that I did was actually to see not only the interface of where technology and innovation was going, but I also got to see who was paying for the theater that humanity lives in. And that is interesting.
So by theater, you mean sort of like it's an act or an illusion, that there's a deeper reality
Yes.
that we don't see. The John Q. public like me doesn't really see it.
Yeah, so let me give you a simple example, because it's easy to unpack it in kind of a very simple analogy. For the last 300 years, there is one innovation on this planet that we've paid no attention to at our own expense.
Which is?
And that innovation was life insurance.
Okay.
Now, the reason why we have life insurance, if we go back to the 1700s, is because the Anglican Church decided to cut the salaries of preachers. And they did it under the guise of looking out for the families of those preachers by creating what they called widows and orphans funds. Now, this was a very interesting, bizarre transaction, which basically said the church was going to take in your life, your service. And by the way, you didn't need to worry about the fact you weren't going to make your mortgage payments and you weren't going to make all of your other payments, because in your death, someone else would actually take care of your obligations. That, in the latter part of the 1700s, became one of the principal economic drivers of the United States. And if we go from 1780 to 1880, one of the top 3 GDP contributors to our economy was life insurance.
Okay.
Now, we don't talk about that.
Right.
Anytime there's a topic we don't talk about, I like to talk about it. And the reason I like to talk about it is because what we have to understand is that what we did was we built allegedly a story of America. This was about the industrialist, the agriculturalist, everything else. But behind that was the facade of a much more insidious narrative, which is we decided to make the Protestant work ethic an agency to build the hegemony of a financial industry. And that industry was aligned to the death of humanity, not to its life. Now, that's kind of macabre when you say it that way.
Yes.
When you get to 1904, at the inauguration in 1905, what you see is, standing next to the president, 5 life insurance executives. So when I say that they bought the country in 1905, I'm not saying that metaphorically. Aetna, New York Life, all of the big insurers actually wound up being so influential that by 1911, Congress was investigating the criminal antitrust conspiracies of these companies taking over America. And they concluded that they had.
In what way,
And
as far
the
as
people
influencing the political systems, who's in office,
influence
what?
monetary systems, the fact that we have the Fed the way we have the Fed, the fact that you have the 30-year mortgage. Who knew that the 30-year mortgage was structured not for the benefit of people buying houses and real estate? The 30-year mortgage was structured for the long-dated asset requirements for life insurance companies. That's why we have 30-year treasury notes. That's why we have 30-year mortgages. That's why we have everything living in 30-year increments. Well, we do that because at the turn of the last century, the average productive life expectancy of a blue-collar worker was, are you ready for this? 30 years.
Really?
So the reason why we built our economy on the system we built it was because we knew that we were going to exploit a very interesting intersection, which is on the day you have paid almost all the interest, but you still have an outstanding principal on your real estate, you die. And your life insurance benefit goes to who? Widows and orphans? Nope. The first beneficiary of your life insurance is your unpaid debt. So we actually did a really crazy thing. We were able to foreclose on the death of property. We were able to foreclose on the terminal value of mortgages. And we did that all under the cunning guise of let's get people suckered into this thing called the American dream.
What's the relationship between the banks then and the insurance companies, or life insurance companies?
Well, so in the 1800s, purely interlocking. In fact, the reason why we had the Glass-Steagall Act was to break those up. I mean, so we actually found out that in the 1920s and 1930s, after we found out how corrupt the system was, and that the entirety of the political system in America had been hijacked by these institutions, we actually introduced the Glass-Steagall Act, which broke those companies up. Now, conveniently, we've decided to put them back together, courtesy of the last kind of 25 years of financial shenanigans in Washington. But technically, they still are absolutely interlocking with each other, because if you look at who buys the securitized mortgages, the collateralized obligations of America, it turns out that the Fed, so banks that are part of the Fed consortium, are the owners of the assets created, which ultimately are the long-dated assets that insurance companies buy to take care of death benefits. So the whole thing is still entirely the same interlocking nonsense. And against that backdrop, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid all came out during the same period of time that we actually had the emergence of the regulated banking and securities space. All of those things give rise to a very interesting thing, which in the 1970s we called the Prudent Man Philosophy. The Prudent Man Philosophy very simply was this idea that somehow or another smart people acting prudently, a fiduciary if you will, would actually make good decisions where they would principally buy U.S. denominated debt called fixed income, so treasuries, other U.S. government securities, etc. The problem with all of those things is they were supposed to produce a statutory return between 2 and 3%. That we'd always have that rate.
Right.
So they'd always be good investments. And they would always be backed by the full faith and confidence of the United States. Tiny little problem. In September of 2001, the game changed. And the full faith and confidence in the United States government kind of started collapsing a lot of places. The people that were buying our treasuries were offshore, many of them being Chinese investors, as well as the government itself. But what was more insidious was we were still forcing pensions, life insurances, everything else, to still buy these assets that we knew were not going to have the full faith and confidence of the government behind them. Fast forward to 2007, and I very famously, on air, made the comment that 2008 was coming, and the markets were going to collapse, and the bubbles were going to pop, and the world was going to fall apart. And then I inconveniently pointed out the sequence in which banks were going to fail, which they did a year later.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to have this conversation go, well, why would we listen to a guy who was the only one on camera that got the date and frequency of the collapse of the banking system in 2008, again in 2011, called the short that was done on the U.S. dollar in 2011 to go to 2018 to make sure that there was no chance we could ever recover our Social Security funds. Why would we listen to a guy that's actually done all of those things on record before they happened and has so far always actually landed the plane right on the deck? That might be the reason why.
Well, it's kind of stunning, but how are you able to gaze into that crystal ball? What is it that you're looking at that gets you to forecast these things?
Well, so that's a funny question because I actually use the cunning divination tool called reading.
You actually do that?
Yeah, it's amazing. I just read different things than most people read.
Yeah.
So I'm very long that criminals are going to tell you what they're going to do because they love, part of their fantasy about being a criminal is they actually love to tell you what the crime is before they do it or while they're doing it or after they do it because they're almost taunting you to actually find them.
Right.
You know, serial killers do that all the time. They carve a little, little marking into somebody or they leave a little talisman or they do something to go, ha, you can't find me. But I've given you something to find me, but you can't find me, right? That's a very common sociopathic thing. And it turns out that criminals do that in financial situations too. We just don't know what to read. So if I actually told you, I read ISDA contracts, you'd probably go, I don't even know what ISDA is.
That's right.
If I said I read CMO and CDO obligation agreements, you'd go, I'm not sure what I know what that is. If I said I read credit default swap agreements, you'd go, I've heard credit default swap, but I don't exactly know what that means. And you certainly wouldn't want to read as far into it to find things like one of the ISDA contracts, which is the international agreement that governs when bankruptcies are technically really bankruptcies, which is very interesting because for the rest of us, a bankruptcy is when your liabilities exceed your assets. It's kind of a simple thing.
Right.
Not if you're a big corporation, not if you're a big financial institution. Because the ISDA contracts are actually contracts that set forth the rules of how we're going to agree when insolvency actually really happened. And they might or they might not agree. That's the best part about it. But inside all these documents, Patrick, there's an amazing thing called terms. And terms are, this contract is in effect until.
Right.
So when I forecast the collapse of the banks, let me walk you through how complex this was. In 2001, when George Bush stood up and said we're going to increase the financial limits for the FDIC and we're going to increase the depository limits, and then we're going to shorten the duration of the treasuries that we're going to issue from 30 years to 7 years, and we do all these machinations. I looked at who bought the contracts, and I read the contracts. Turns out they all had terms. And so I know this is going to come as a total streak of genius, but I actually looked at dates on calendars and said, 7 years from today is this day.
And that was it.
And it was amazing to actually realize that in a world where criminals hide their crimes in plain sight, they count on no one looking at them. Right? Today, anybody can go on to either the Social Security Administration's accounting or the Congressional Budget Office. Anybody can go on and read the actuarial statements, which actually tell us when the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid pension program goes to zero. Now, anybody could do that. I can assure you that I'm probably one of, 3 or 4 people in the history of humanity that reads every sentence of every one of those reports. So the reason I can say this is I can look at their asset holdings, I can look at what they're expecting the returns to be, and I can then do this cunning thing like whip out a calculator and go, well, they're not going to make it to where they think they're going to make it because they think they're going to run out of money in 2031 or 2032. And their assumptions actually prove that they're wrong by 4 years right now, and that 4 years may become 3 years before long.
When I look at these situations, because you refer to criminals, right? And I guess there's the literal and the figurative, meaning, there are some criminals literally breaking laws, and some that are criminal in their intent, but they find ways to manipulate the laws to their own advantage.
Yeah.
And I have a hard time distinguishing who are actual mastermind criminals and who are useful idiots. We saw this in COVID, very often, where there's a lot of really criminal behavior as far as the public health policy and what they've done to people, et cetera, et cetera. And there are people carrying out that policy, and some of them I think are just useful idiots. They just don't. They're not really. They think they're doing the right thing, and then some people are willfully intending to do the wrong thing. So do you try to observe one versus the other?
Yeah, but I also think we need to do another unpacking of the nuance, because there's another piece that's equally important. There are an enormous number of people for whom crimes only apply at a certain threshold.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you came to my house and robbed my house, we'd call you a thief.
Right.
If you came to my house dressed like me and you told me that you were taking my money to invest it in, something that would ultimately be good for my future, like a fixed income investment in a government-backed security, which was guaranteed in your presentation to be a safe asset, because obviously we have absolute security in the future of America, so therefore it's a risk-free asset. And by the way, that's how they sell it, risk-free asset. You're stealing from me. but you're doing it in a suit and a tie. And you're taking money under the guise of a fiduciary. And it turns out because you did it in a suit and a tie, because you took me to a steakhouse, because you did all of the things you did to sell me on the credibility of your position, you still are a thief. You're just a very well-dressed, very cunning, very elegant thief. But you're still a thief. The likelihood that you're going to go to jail is very low, because people will go, well, but he dressed nicely, and he seemed to be nice, and he took you to dinner. But you're no less a thief. And interestingly enough, our securities laws and our, criminal laws are very clear that these behaviors are gross misrepresentations to the public for which the public ultimately is the victim. The problem is, if it's done with people wearing suits, it's very often the case that no one ever cares.
Does intent play a role in that? If the financial manager in the suit, believes what he's saying and thinks it's the right thing because that's what he's been told by the people who run his, management fund, his wealth management fund, does that make him? He's still a thief as far as the impact, but he didn't intend to rob you. He just was a useful idiot in the process.
Well, but therein lies the beauty and the elegance of a justice system. There's no felony for which ignorance is a defense.
So he can claim ignorance, but did he? So the guy who does that, did he really break laws?
Yeah,
he did.
Yeah, very clear laws. That's what we have the securities laws of the United States for. The 33 and 34 Acts were specifically built so this couldn't happen. Many of these are felonies. So these are people who would go to jail if they were prosecuted. But because they were born on the right side of the tracks, they look a certain way, they dress a certain way, they're the alum of the certain, business school or comm school or wherever they are, the law just doesn't apply. So this is kind of the tragedy. The tragedy is we've been seduced into justifying an immoral act because it's done politely.
So now you've got these people who are, let's say, the CEOs and the boards of the life insurance companies. And you've got a Fed chairman, you've got the heads of all these banks. Is there private, kind of call it off-the-record conversations and collusion between these individuals to say, here's how we're going to take them for the ride and this is how we're going to continue to do? Because it's hard for me to believe that a conspiracy could be on that large a scale, and that nobody suddenly, has a moment of conscience and says, we've got to, I'm going to blow the whistle on this. This is all wrong.
Well, but remember that leading up to the '08 crisis, we knew, and we knew this for 7 years, we knew that the rating agencies who were saying things were investment-grade investments, we knew that, first of all, they got paid for their ratings by the people issuing the investments.
Conflict of interest.
Right, so, you can pay me $20 and I'll say it's okay. Pay me $50 and I'll tell you it's really good. Pay me $1,000 and I'll say that it's,
The top.
winged angels, right? And here's the problem. The problem is, yes, we have this incredulity that says, could somebody be that bad? Could somebody actually be that sinister? And the answer is yes. And by the way, we've had it multiple times in the last 2 decades. We had the rating agencies, by all accounts, it's important to point out, to this day, no rating agency executive went to jail for the crimes that financial players did go to jail for.
Wow.
Now, it turns out the rating agencies were the ones that were committing the worst crime, which was gross misrepresentation of the quality of assets. Not one of them got even a slap on the wrist.
Wow.
So I get why everybody's sitting around their dinner table at night goes, could it be that audacious? And the answer is absolutely. We only found out that there was price fixing on currency swaps across the Atlantic because banks started getting hurt. Now, the Daily Investor had been brutalized by this behavior. And it went not only to the investor, it went to the price you paid for groceries. It didn't matter until banks were hurting other banks. And at that point, the banks go, oh, somebody should look into this. And then a couple guys get slapped on the wrist and the crime is revealed. But even then, it's the one trader who was doing a rogue thing, and you sit there going, but the rogue trader was doing it at the behest of a financial institution. See, these things actually turn out to be crimes. Yeah. We know, for example, that BlackRock, for reasons that no one can quite explain, was hired by the United States government to buy treasuries at par.
How did they get hired?
Yeah, that would be the question that kind of everybody should be asking.
Right.
How could you get a sole source contract to buy assets for the government issued by the government? Does that sound like if the rest of us would do that, that would feel kind of money laundering-ish?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, because that's what it is. And then buying long-dated assets. These are things that have 7-year, 10-year, 15, and 30-year maturities. Buying them at par. Well, what does that mean? What it means is that if I buy a treasury today, my expectation is that I will get the value at maturity. The difference, the spread between what I pay today and maturity is why it's an investment.
Right.
But if I pay today the face value of the maturity instrument, I'm telling you that instrument is not what you think it is. It's not a bond. Well, and then if I get paid to do that, now I know that I've got a propaganda machine that's actually pretending that we're issuing these things called government guaranteed securities. And I know that the government isn't even backing these, because it's getting all of its money not only taken from it 30 years early, but they're paying somebody to do it.
So it doesn't. Why would BlackRock have an interest in buying something that they're not going to make any money on?
Well, that's why they got paid to buy it.
So basically, they're paid to buy it at par, and when it matures, they're only getting back.
Well, they're
getting interest up front.
They're conveniently distributing these things to their clients.
Oh,
they're conveniently getting them out to the rest of the market. The likelihood, as we sit here today, is your 401k probably has.
That's why I don't have a 401k.
Some of this crap. Well, yeah. The people watching.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. If you have a 401k. You're owning something that has no value, and you're told it's a risk-free asset. Now, that was a public procurement, by the way, non-competitive. So BlackRock got the contract without having to compete for it. So figure that one out. A bunch of things are wrong about what I'm telling you, like really fundamentally wrong about what I'm telling you. The problem is all of these things lead us to the moment, which in 2028, we know that the government itself has actually said we have no confidence past 2028, which is the reason why you do something dumb, like have an institution buy treasury assets at par, because you know you're never going to be able to refinance them. You know there's not going to be a secondary market. So you're creating the illusion of the preservation of an asset, but at the exact same time you're hedging your bet and saying, I know it's not going to live to maturity.
So basically, they're just trying to prolong the inevitable. Is there a way out of this? I mean, is there a way that some sanity or rationality could be injected into the system economically, or is it basically they're just scrambling to try to prop it up with whatever fictitious means they can, but by 2028, the game is over? How do you see it?
Well, so that's a beautiful question, because you remember the Roadrunner cartoons, right?
Oh, sure.
When the Roadrunner's running along, and then he goes off the edge of a cliff and he keeps his legs spinning.
Yeah.
And as long as he keeps his legs spinning, he can actually run past the clouds. And you know what happens next is he looks down. And it only is when he looks down that he actually falls, which is really funny. But what's funnier yet is what you don't see in the film, but it always seems to show up, is there's an anvil that's floating above the Roadrunner. Because not only does the Roadrunner fall, but then the Acme anvil falls on top of the Roadrunner. So you get the double splat, right?
Yep.
Well, that's kind of what's happening right now. We are in the Roadrunner off the cliff phase. And so right now we're running past clouds, pretending that everything is kind of off, but still we're making it. The look down moment is 2028. But we're not talking about the anvil that's above the look down moment. But we always know that in the cartoon, there's always an anvil up there too. And that's the part that I find most fascinating, because the system that we have right now, which was built, once again, to underwrite not the military-industrial complex, but the pharmaceutical-industrial complex. Cunningly in 1961, we were told, beware the military-industrial complex. We should have been told, beware the pharmaceutical-industrial complex, which has been running the entire show of the Occidental world since 1604. Right? The British East India Company, most recently, that opium tobacco dealing company that brought sugar and opium and tobacco into the lives of all of the civilized world. That company, which became ultimately the company from which companies like Bayer and Wellcome Trust and AstraZeneca and then Pfizer and Moderna and all these kinds of other companies spring. That particular industry is the industry that's run the world for the last, 420 years.
Wow.
Great news is they're about to have the clock run out.
Why is that good news?
Well, it's good news because we should actually take a step back as humanity and go, is an economy based on drug dealing a pro-human economy? That's a pretty decent question to ask.
Yeah, well, I've been asking for a long time, and I'm no fan of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
But when a clock runs out on them, what happens to
Well, so that's the fun piece. Because the fun piece is we, the people, have a remedy. But the remedy is we have to immediately start detaching from our dependency on our drug dealing and drug addiction of how we've decided health is essentially crisis intervention, which is I wait to get sick and then I rush to the hospital or the doctor or the pharmacy or the whatever else. I plead with them to give me some sort of chemical toxin that is going to take care of one problem while killing another part of my organ systems. That model is broken.
Yeah.
And the great news is we can actually start doing something about it today to weaken the consequence of 2028. But more importantly, if we actually take a step back and say, between now and 2028, if intelligent, thoughtful people say, you know what, I'm going to look at my entire worldview, and I'm going to look at how I save for my future. I'm going to look at how much I'm spending on life insurance. I'm going to look on what I'm doing with health insurance. I'm going to take all that information in and say, I'm only going to put my capital where it's aligned to my life, not aligned to my death. The average person would actually change 70% of their total asset holdings with that one question. We would actually step away from the system that's killing us.
Do you agree that having some sort of indemnification against a premature death, is a good thing to have for your family, or do you think that you shouldn't do life insurance at all?
Well, so I think the insurance model itself is broken. Selling fear is a horrible, horrible, horrible construct. And no matter what you're selling the agency around that story on, I have a problem with any story that relies on fear as its primary motivator. So the idea of life insurance as we currently have it is this facade of being responsible. Obviously, part of your, just good order and discipline is to make sure you're responsible. But it turns out that if you actually deposited your premiums in, an investment, you'd actually achieve the same thing, aligned to your life.
Right.
The reason why we have extraordinarily large life insurance policies is because we're not living at human scale.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you might think that you need a $500,000 policy or $1 million policy because you've decided that your lifestyle can only be achieved with a certain number of bedrooms in houses and number of cars in the garage and the brand of the car in the garage and everything else. What we've done is we've trapped ourselves in an illusion that says our identity is linked